Welcome to BaldPolitiKs, where we take a look at politics from another angle. And the focus of this episode is on North Korea, and in particular the visit of Derek Ford of the Hampton Institute to North Korea itself, the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. The visit took place against the background of the US's ban on US citizens visiting North Korea. They did it 1 month before that went into place. And not to be too influenced by what they've seen in the media, Derek Ford and others from the Hampton Institute visited North Korea to see for themselves what conditions were like there and what life was like there indeed itself. So I'm going to be speaking to Derek about that in this episode of BaldPolitiKs. Before we get to that, let's take a look at some of the significant happenings on the 7th of September. In 1652, around 15,000 Han farmers and militia rebel against Dutch rule in Taiwan. In 1778, the American Revolutionary War, France invades Dominica in the British West Indies before Britain is even aware that France is in the war. And in 1901, the Boxer Rebellion in the Qing Dynasty, China, officially ends with the signing of the Boxer Protocol, all on the 7th of September. So, as I said, in this episode, I'm speaking to Derek Ford of the Hampton Institute in the United States about his visit to North Korea. So let's have a listen to what Derek had to say.
So the Hampton Institute, it's a working class think tank. Ultimately, it's a space for organizers, activists, and theorists to speak with each other and sort of debate the pressing issues that movements across the world are facing, and to propose ways to move forward. Okay. From whatever impasses we currently find ourselves in.
Okay, so the situation as of now in relation to North Korea and US citizens is that US citizens are not allowed to travel to North Korea. What happens if a US citizen does that or attempts to do that?
Yeah, so they can have their passport revoked, and I think that the ultimate sentence could be something like 10 years in prison.
Really? And that would happen, you return to the United States, that's what would happen. Okay.
Yeah, it's what could potentially happen, right? If you were to get caught, and yeah.
Okay. So based on your recent visit to North Korea, what, or not exactly what did you see, but how did that compare to the media reports we hear in the West? Because the reports we hear in the West is that the people are starving, it's a very repressive regime, there's no freedom to speak out, and so forth. What did you see in relation to those points?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, really, in many ways, I saw the exact opposite of what we get from the mainstream media in Western countries. I think that it's true that obviously at some points in the DPRK's history, there have been very difficult periods in the 1990s, in particular, and for some reason, the sort of worst images from that worst period have been fixed as the permanent reality in that country. But in fact, the DPRK economically is doing very well. Yeah, since 2006, they've invested heavily in light industry, and they've been able to do that as a result of their turn to nuclear weapons as opposed to conventional weapons. It's much more cost effective to pursue nuclear weapons. And so today in Korea, in the DPRK, you actually find a really diverse, self-sufficient economy. Now, they've been forced to do that because of the sanctions. So what you see are a lot of consumer goods that are made in the DPRK and that are of really good quality. So you see people, talking on cell phones. There's 4.5 million cell phones in the country. They have their own cell phone network. They have their own internet. So it's clearly a country that, is quite capable of, it's developing quite well, and it's doing it not only independently, but, like in defiance of so much of the international community.
Okay. And how exactly are they achieving that self-sufficiency? Because it's on a peninsula. They don't deal with their southern neighbours. They only have one neighbour, really, which is China. So is all of that coming through their trade with China, or are they developing mobile phones and internet all by themselves?
Yeah, well, the technology is all indigenous.
Okay.
The technology is all indigenous, and trade with China, some trade with Russia, and they, they found a way to, to make, quite significant, rapid improvements in all manner of life, not just military, but also industrial, agricultural. And I mean, one of the things is that, in the DPRK, there's no unemployment. All of the countries, everyone's intellectual capacities are developed and mobilized in the service of development. Unlike, here in the United States, we have, just like millions of people who have already developed intellectual capacities, or, who could, but are unemployed because they can't be at the service of capitalism. So it's, because it's a fundamentally different social system, they're able to achieve a lot.
Okay. Now, you mentioned nuclear weapons. It's more cost effective for them to produce those. This is where they have come into conflict with the West. Their testing of nuclear weapons. Is that being done purely as a cost-effective method by them, or is that them squaring up to the West, saying you're not going to tell us what to do, or is it none of the above?
Mm-hmm. I think that they view, development of nuclear weapons as an insurance policy against the United States. That's, as history has sort of borne out, if you give in to the West demands, that you will not get what they promise you, right? Both the John Maria government in Libya, the Ba'athist government in Iraq were told that if they stopped pursuing nuclear weapons, right, then everything would be okay. And of course, they were disarmed and then they were invaded. And the DPRK knows that. And the DPRK is, they're not gonna. They haven't yet cowered to the United States. Even after, the destruction that the U.S. wrought in that country during the war. And, I think that, they're very proud of their sort of ability to defeat and stand up to the United States, because they're a small nation. They started with nothing. When they started their colonial struggle against their anti-Japanese colonial struggle, they didn't even have weapons. And they beat Japan. They beat the United States, and they didn't have an air force. They weren't dropping bombs on anyone. They beat the United States. They forced an armistice, and since then they've stood up to the United States. And that's a point of pride in the country, because the Soviet Union collapsed. Right? China is no longer the China that it was in at the time of the revolution. So here's this tiny nation that has survived, and that is sort of ingrained in the fiber of their being. And it's definitely not going away anytime soon.
Okay. And are the memories of the war, the North Korea, South Korea, the 1950s war with the USA as well, are they still alive? Or is it still, do they still remember the mass bombing, the leveling of North Korea that conducted by the USA?
Yeah, it's a sort of fundamental feature of daily life there. Because for one, there's veterans of that war. And that's who the sort of, many of the people in leadership were veterans. Everyone has been affected by that war, of course, has lost someone, a relative. And it's very much sort of, it's a fundamental feature of daily life. And there's different ways you can interpret that, right? You could say that it's, the sort of cynical reading is that that's how the ruling party is able to maintain its power. Okay,
so if the U.S. were to pursue the threats that are being made, the fire and fury threats made by Trump, again, you're not going to pick this up in a visit, but would North Korea be in a position to stand up to that? Or is it just, do they just see this as what Donald Trump is saying? Do they just see that as the ramblings of a madman, or are they in the position to stand up to that?
Mm-hmm. So I think, my impression is that they have been dealing with the threats from the United States since their entire existence. And so Trump's threats are nothing new to them, and they have something to defend. They have something that they're quite proud of, that they're definitely willing to defend. And the entire country is organized already, right? So the entire country could be mobilized immediately to defend the nation.
Right. Okay. Okay. Now, some people might say that your visit there, the photos that you posted, the article that you wrote, that okay, you came on a visit, everything you saw was manufactured. That it was they put on a special show for the West, so you could report back, and this place is fantastic, and what you guys are hearing in the West is nonsense. How would you respond to something like that?
I mean, I have a couple of responses to that. I mean, for one, the idea that everything that we saw was manufactured is, it would be a remarkable feat. I don't think that with the wealth of the United States that they could coordinate. The United States couldn't coordinate that. This sort of tiny nation couldn't. The whole idea that it's like all a show. It's really, it's sort of a Orientalist, like imagination that thousands of people that are dedicated just to living life according to the sort of Western standards, right? And the other thing I'll say is that the Koreans, they're very proud of their nation, and that includes everything, right? It's not just the biggest skyscrapers in Pyongyang they're proud of, and so we saw many places that and we stayed in places that weren't comparable to a 5-star hotel in New York City. We did stay at a place that was like that.
The sanctions, probably we could see more sanctions being imposed in North Korea. I mean, the atmosphere doesn't seem to be thawing. If something like that were to go ahead or to continue, what effect do you think that might have in North Korea?
Well, sanctions can only have a sort of damaging effect on the population, preventing, needed materials from getting in. But here's the thing: is that the sanctions haven't been working. The sanctions regime has been intensified now for decades, and the DPRK hasn't crumbled. The government hasn't gotten weaker. There's been no instability in the country, so that's not going to change anytime soon. And I think also that, and I hope that Russia and China will begin to stand up to the United States in this regard and stop going along with the sanctions.
So thanks to Derek and all at the Hampton Institute for their time on that and for telling us more about their visit. If you want to know more, you can check them out on hamptoninstitute.org. So that's about it from us on Bald Politics for this episode. Why not join us again where we take a look at politics from another angle.
I was the one when you needed love.